Oh, you guys were in Sunside, right?
Yeah, we were.
Yeah, I'm here now. I remember all the when we were on FaceTime.
The hybrid room.
Oh, running around. I didn't know you were over there. I was like, who is she showing the phone to?
And that was so awkward. I did not mean to like shove her in your face. I was just showing her the room.
Yeah, that was so fun.
Oh, no. Not
Oh,
I was
like
like,
that.
All right, once I email this.
Something.
Well, just in case beforehand as well.
Oh yeah. Did you get the email chain?
I did.
Jeff, you got it as well.
Yeah, but I'm gonna need a slight second.
That's fine.
Oh, never mind. Abby is doing her job,
Mhm.
so we did. I just assumed she wasn't.
All right, I'm sending you like a case.
Are both teams here? I just can't see them.
Yeah, we're here. Yeah, we're about to start.
Oh, the two in the middle are not on the same team.
No.
No.
Okay, that makes more sense.
Yep.
Thank you.
Did you get the email chain, Luke?
Yeah,
Okay, cool.
give me a hot second.
Yeah, just let me know when you're good.
Yeah, I was like low key waiting for the other team to show up, so I was like, I don't need to do this real quick.
That's good. Yeah.
Just to be sure my ballot's right, NSU is neg speaking first.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So is everyone good?
Yep.
All right, cool. I'm Elon Arias, first speaker for NSU. Time will start on my first word. Maria and I negate the resolution. Contention when it's pandemics. The next pandemic is inevitable and will be more deadly. Smiteham 21 finds that the next pandemic could be much sooner and more severe than we think. The frequency and severity of spillover infectious diseases is increasing. They estimate a 57% chance of another global pandemic as deadly as COVID in the next years. It will be far worse, and the globe is dangerously unprepared, as Scientific American in 22 finds that the next time could be worse. Also notable is the failure of governments to use our current predicament to rectify glaring public health deficiencies. The Global Health Security Index rated 195 countries as dangerously unprepared to deal with future pandemic threats. Luckily, current U.S. disengagement from West Asia has increased regional diplomatic relations. And E21 finds that the disengagement of the U.S. from the West Asia has led the Gulf states and other countries to reassess their positions and try to mend relations with old rivals. This made several West Asia leaders realize that in the absence of the U.S. protective shield, they must bury the hatchet with old enemies. So they decide to give diplomacy a chance. This has increased pandemic cooperation. Rossi and Cavani and 20 find that all 6 members of the GCC agreed to establish a network to protect food supplies. The Gulf states have decided to let go of petty grievances for the greater good. The U.S. has abandoned its traditional leadership, offering an opening for other players. The crisis also presents an opportunity for countries like those in the Gulf to step up. GCC countries have already shown that they are capable of acting effectively to contain the pandemic. Gulf states have also provided substantial humanitarian aid to other countries. Aspiring global leaders must demonstrate that they can create alliances and collaborate with their neighbors. Doing so will require more action. Re-engagement reverses this progress, as Ashford 18 finds that American predominance in the region prevents states from balancing in the face of threats as they would in the absence of U.S. presence. States expected to form alliances have rarely done so and prioritize ideological factors over security concerns. In acting as a third party, U.S. involvement inhibits developing ties. Pandemics disproportionately harm women, which is ignored by policymakers. Wenham 20 finds that women are affected more than men by the social and economic effects of infectious disease outbreaks. They are disproportionately disadvantaged by reduced access to health services. They are more affected by job losses. That can leave political and policy responses flying blind. Contention 2 is a trade-off. Biden's current diplomatic focus is on China, diverting from current initiatives risk failure. Weight 22 finds that Biden finally concentrated on realizing its Asian ambitions. China was the only country with both the intent and the capacity to challenge the international order. Therefore, the administration's strategy is to invest, align, and compete with China. The State Department has redoubled efforts to align U.S. allies and partners. The Defense Department has also been fortifying U.S. military partnerships in the region. The administration would strive to redirect Chinese foreign policies in a more positive direction. Biden stressed the unwavering U.S. commitment to the region and underscored that his strategy will be matched with resources and steady implementation. The administration relaunched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for prosperity. U.S. officials need to make continuing progress with attention focused on a few critical projects with adequate funding rather than spreading too thinly or competing with existing frameworks. Diplomacy elsewhere shifts time, resources, and focus as Powell 22 finds that establishing our priorities means putting resources to work on their achievement, beginning with time and focus of the department. These urgent global issues can only be successfully addressed through diplomacy, and we must devote more resources. This will require sustained policy attention and clear priorities. Diplomacy must be strategically coherent. Achieving success will require commitment to enhanced training and multilateral expertise within the Foreign Service and the Department Civil Service. Biden containment of China through active diplomacy avoids a catastrophic China war. Fazio 21 finds that Biden recognizes the limits of American power and is investing in diplomacy to prevent conflict with China. Active diplomacy may be the best way to constrain the belligerence of Xi. Knowing it is unlikely to prevail in a conflict could constrain China's behavior in the region. Engaging with allies is the best way to avoid the United States and China going to war because each fear the other poses a real threat to their geostrategic interests. If conflict does break out, it will involve regional allies. Active diplomacy provides a strong mechanism to contain China. Any conflict goes nuclear or Hanlon and Holding in 20 find that Beijing continues to probe and test U.S. result-provoking crisis which could escalate. That is the way World War I began a century ago, and it could happen again. Simulations rapidly escalate into full-scale conflict, bringing China and the United States to the doorstep of nuclear war. It might amount to large-scale conflict between nuclear superpowers. Communication systems might be targeted through cyber attack. This causes extinction. Star 17 concludes that the war could significantly disrupt the global weather for at least a decade, which would result in a global famine. The smoke would absorb warming sunlight. The effects of a nuclear war fought by the United States and China would doom the entire human population. For all these reasons, Maria and I so proudly indicate.
It's in my case.
Yep.
Okay. Let me know when you.
I haven't gotten it yet.
Oh, it's good, yeah.
Yeah, we're good.
Anyone not ready then? We affirm first is framing for impacts regarding women, 2 warrants, 8 education, utilitarian logic shifts the conversation to unrealistic events we learn nothing from, but centering structural violence combats this. Jackson 12 says that what you've been told about the big threats is one big con to distract you from poverty, inequality, and structural violence. Rulers are hoping you won't notice any increase in inequality. Domestic violence and poverty and preventable diseases kills tens of millions. Terror is more exciting than stories about how poor people are discriminated against. The advocacy skills debating about things like gender disparities creates the tools to solve policymaking issues in the real world. Round Sandler 16. There has been a notable shift in securing attention to gender equality in large foundations and institutions. Feminist officials' potential to support social transformative action depends on them having a feminist commitment and motivation combined with a political ability to operate strategically within the confines of a bureaucratic system. Pursuing gender equality can be working both within the institutions to change the norms and practices in outside institutions to build pressure on institutions to change. Thus, the role of the ballot is to vote for the team that proves or disproves whether the resolution is good for women. Contention 1 is gender equality. U.S. diplomacy is key to improve gender rights in West Asia. It's at the forefront of Biden's approach. Salafate 21. Biden has taken a strong stance on promotion of women's rights in its foreign policy. Biden created the Gender Policy Council to advance equity. The administration is appointing a record number of women to cabinet positions. As a major world actor, the U.S. is the leading opinion maker when it comes to the Middle East. The U.S. plays an important role in political reality. Specifically, U.S. pressure could be applied to Turkey that solves the because Erdogan's elections and economic troubles. Ringler 21. Turkey's response to crises leading up to the election by 2023 will determine the relationship with the U.S. Beneficial relations with the U.S. Turkey's desire for beneficial relations with the U.S. will provide opportunities for engagement. Erdogan is risk-taking but not risk oblivious. He'll test the limits of the U.S. The impact is gender violence. Turkey will use expanded influence to attack women. Franceman 21. Whenever Ankara has expanded its influence, women's rights have decreased from Libya to Qatar. Turkey targeted Kurdish women in Syria and played a key role. Women played a key role in politics. Turkey has rounded them up and imprisoned them on terror charges despite having no evidence. Our second contention is climate diplomacy. West Asia is the worst off region when it comes to the effects of climate change. It's impossible to ignore. Ramahan 22. West Asia is among the regions worst affected by climate change. Water scarcity alone is estimated to cause countries in the region a GDP loss of 6% by 2050. The region is home to 12 of the world's 17 most water scarce countries, and climate change is expected to increase this further. The developed world promised to spend $100 billion each year to combat the crisis. However, the countries have failed. Fortunately, diplomacy is key to address climate change, which is conflict prevention and resolution. Brady 22. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. U.S. conflict policy must meet the future by centering climate change within conflict prevention. The U.S. needs to remain committed to a conflict prevention agenda which recognizes the influence of climate change. Climate change can drive unstable social, economic, and political conditions. That means selecting priority countries and moving forward with investments in conflict prevention that are actively informed by climate change. Indeed, Biden has already limited bilateral agreements, affirming its key for regional discussions. Cardolas and Joel 21. While various country-specific bilateral climate programs run by the U.S. could help, a wider regional approach that leverages the region's wealth and technical know-how would be beneficial. For all the differences between the U.S. and countries such as Saudi Arabia, these countries will play an important role in efforts to implement a global energy transition and combat climate change. Luckily, a regional treaty has a global impact. American leadership is the only path of progress. Holtman 21. The world sees the importance of U.S. action. Credible U.S. action is critical as the world's largest economy, second largest emitter, and superpower re-engaging on climate diplomacy. U.S. actions can either dampen or accelerate global action. If the U.S. fails, it'll be harder for others to pressure other countries. The impact is gender inequality. UN 22 says that 80% of people displaced by climate change are women. Due to climate change, women and girls are often left out, unable to work. Women and girls make up more than 40% of the agricultural labor. Thus, we strongly effort.
Yeah. Yeah. Whenever, are you good?
Yeah.
No, it's fine. Let's start on your contention one on gender equality.
Yeah.
So specifically your second card, the tag says U.S. pressure can be applied to Turkey. Where in this evidence does it mention like human rights abuses, for example, like working with them for human rights abuses?
Yeah, so we're saying because Erdogan is having an election next, and because Biden, which is our first uniqueness card, is focusing on gender equality, when we pressure them and increase diplomatic efforts and pressure them on human rights abuses, they're going to decrease because he has to cave into
Yeah,
US
so
pressure.
where in this card doesn't mention human rights
Yeah,
abuses?
it's talking about generally like US pressure will be key, like Turkey's response to crises leading up to the election by 2023 will determine the relationship.
Yeah. So
with the US.
I see
Like,
that. I see that, but I don't see like if you command F the card, it doesn't even mention like human rights abuses once. It doesn't mention gender equality. It just says that the U.S. has like the capability to pressure Turkey. How do we know that when they pressure Turkey, this is specific to like human rights abuses and gender inequality?
That's our Salake 21 evidence saying that like Biden has taken a strong stand. So when we increase diplomatic ties, since Biden is right now focusing on women's rights and focusing on all of the human rights abuses, Turkey will cave in when the U.S. says so. Can I have a question?
Yeah, sure.
So let's talk about your pandemics argument. Sure. What pandemic will arise from West Asia?
It doesn't have to arise from West Asia. We just mitigate the effects of any pandemic that spreads. We'd say that when you have GCC cooperation, you're able to cooperate on things like info sharing, medical sharing, food shortages, things like that happen due to pandemic. So we'd say that a pandemic is really likely per our evidence, and that right now lots of countries are unprepared. The only way to mitigate the effects of these pandemics are to cooperate with all these West Asian countries.
So first of all, why is West Asia key, and how is this like an internal armed conflict?
Well, West Asia is key for West Asia, right? Like no other country can solve or like mitigate the effects of a pandemic inside West Asia. Like West Asian countries need to cooperate to solve their own problems.
Of course.
That is why when the US was in the region, for example, during COVID, they had a really slow response.
Yeah.
Okay. Which internal armed conflicts are any of your contentions trying to solve?
Yeah. So the first one with women, it's an internal armed conflict when like Turkey increases like its influence, it increases the attacks against like Kurdish people or attacks against Kurdish people and force them to bail and like displaces them. But the second thing about like climate change, it's causing like, because of climate change, it is causing more like resource wars because of like places like water scarcity in West Asia. Can I have a question?
Yeah, for sure.
So let's talk about your pandemics argument.
Okay.
Which internal armed armed conflict is that solving?
Right, we say that when you increase diplomacy to solve internal armed conflict, that takes resource, time, and focus. If we shift our resource, time, and focus,
Wait.
when you increase diplomacy, I got confused, second contention. When you increase
Okay.
diplomacy to solve internal armed conflict, like any internal armed conflict that's happening in West Asia, that means that these GCC countries no longer
Like what
cooperate.
specific internal armed
It could,
conflict?
like,
You're just like
literally-
trying to correlate to
Right,
drastically.
the NEG doesn't have to specify like specifically which internal armed conflict. We just have to say that when you increase diplomacy to solve internal armed conflicts, we see a decrease
But
in
why is
GCC
pandemics
cooperation.
in that? Like when you increase it, why is pandemics?
Okay,
like,
so
one
the,
of
so the
main
argument is that when
focuses?
you increase US diplomacy to solve internal armed conflicts, GCC countries stop cooperating.
Okay,
Let me save my dog.
Where'd you say that?
Sorry. It's gonna be an off and then whatever I get to from case, so if anyone needs a separate sheet of paper. You can get that. Do you want me to send it?
can you?
Yeah, sure. I'll just probably won't read everything, so I'll just resend it after.
Okay.
Yeah. Is it starting with the off?
Yeah, so start with the off, then your framing, and then down your face.
Sorry, to be clear, new sheet of paper, framing, and then case.
Yeah, that's the order.
Cool beans.
I just sent case. Let me know whenever you mix it. Did I put it?
No.
I think I just-
Just
Are we good? All right, let's begin. Now, on the off, AC interpretation, after limited diplomatic efforts within the sole purpose of ending armed conflicts in West Asia involving non-state actors, A2 indicates purpose as Merriam-Webster 22 defines two, used as a function word to indicate purpose, intention, result, or end came to our aid to indicate a result of an action broken into all pieces. B, peacefully means without violence or conflict as Merriam-Webster 22 finds that, finds untroubled by conflict, a state of peace devoid of violence or force. C is resolve means deal with conflict successfully as Merriam-Webster 22 defines to deal with successfully resolve a dispute. D, internal armed conflicts involve non-state actors and are legally distinct from interstate issues, as Law 22 finds that a non-international or international armed conflict refers to violence involving government forces and one or more armed groups or between groups, in contrast to an international armed conflict, which opposes armed forces of states. In non-international armed conflicts, at least one of the two opposing sides is a non-state group. In non-international conflict, triggers the law of armed conflict. Second is the violation. Neither gender equality or diplomacy or climate change is for the purpose of resolving a current armed conflict between non-state actors, but is a broader diplomacy strategy. Their C1 is an overarching diplomacy claim about why it's good for gender equality, and then their C2 is talking about future potential conflicts, not a current internal armed conflict. Literally nothing in the case specifies an internal armed conflict. Don't let them come up with completely new warrants in future speeches about their case. It's pretty abusive. 3, vote neg. A is limit. Anything else exploits this topic to tangential diplomatic issues between any combination of countries in West Asia, such as arms control, sanctions, security alliances, basing counterterrorism, etc., which is impossible to prepare in a month, ensuring the app can win every debate by breaking new diplomacy contentions. B is education. It skirts the core controversy of US diplomatic effectiveness in peace talks, which provides a narrow locus of class that's key to engagement because the literature is already app biased and there are few diplomacy bad advocates. Reject reasonability. This must be a voting issue to set a precedent for tournaments in January, given the signal. Otherwise, there will be a proliferation of apps and losing incentivizes them to read topical arguments in the future. Go to the framing. T comes before substance, including their impact framing. Even if the app has substantive education and policy, if the net can't predict or prepare for it, it's a reason the debate shouldn't have happened and precludes class necessary to test their framing. It means that T is a priority to any case outweighs or pre-fiat outweighs arguments. But B, we access their framing for two reasons. First is the Jackson evidence says that ongoing conflict like disease are discounted by traditional impact health. Not that any utilitarianism is a problem, and Chinese expansion creates increased authoritarianism globally. For a second contention, they're historically known for exploiting marginalized individuals like Uyghur Muslim communities and women, which definitely outweighs because it happens in every country. But second is institutions rouse us that feminist thinkers can call for measures to transform society. Not that all policy with inequality impact is inherently liberatory. Our turns case arguments prove they're not the policies that the evidence would call for. On the role of the ballot is to vote for the team who did the better debating. Anything else is arbitrary and insulates the app from having to defend the consequences of advocacy, destroying clash. On their C1 about gender equality, first, U.S. diplomacy aid is inextricably linked to the expansion of neoliberalism, as WEOE 16 finds that the U.S. has offered more economic aid and has further opened its domestic markets to those that follow neoliberalism. The U.S. has made accepting neoliberalism a major condition for the dispersal of aid, and neoliberal economies worsen exploitation on women through dismantling the economic safety net, as NAS in 2013 finds that neoliberalism, dismantling of the economic safety net, and privatization have increased the burden on women. The reduction of welfare, social services, and market strategies have led to a corresponding increase in women's workloads. Cut the card there. Go to their C2. On climate diplomacy, first, climate change is locked in. View their evidence as climate appeasement, as Library 22 finds that many climate scientists are more scared about the future than they are willing to admit in public. He calls their reluctance to acknowledge the futility of current climate action climate appeasement. But secondly, Gulf oil producers won't give up fossil fuels. Free commitments are a cover, and dependence makes the impact inevitable, as Lambrona 22 finds that they've gone far from slowing down and blocking climate action to setting up giant pavilions and destroying an army of lobbyists with new messages. The very countries that have made them feel unwelcome to last year's summit in Glasgow are now pressing them to pump more oil and gas. Finally, Gulf climate commitments fail. They can't even meet Paris and are locked into fossil fuels, as the Badu 22 finds that there's little assurance from policymakers in committing to climate change. Taking the Middle East and North Africa as a specific case, achieving commitments are currently a major burden on policymakers, since the economic development is highly linked with non-renewable energy consumption.
Are the judges okay with a little bit of flex spread? Sure. What does it mean? Like, how can we not? Do people get counter interps on T? Like, what do you mean don't reject reasonability?
Like reasonability arguments, you can respond to the T argument.
So reasonability is like, do you want us to give a competing interp, or is me reading defense going to be enough?
It's not a warrant for competing interps. It's just reject reasonability and reasons why it's a voting issue of like why you should be dropped. It's
So
not like,
if I just read defense, is that enough? Like
yeah.
Okay. Also, are any of the things on framing like reasons to vote for you?
Yeah, T comes before substance, and the two reasons why we link into your framing.
Okay, but like those aren't like, okay, yeah.
How much total is that?
Just finishing.
Okay, perfect.
What?
50 seconds.
It's gonna be theory. Let me send the dots.
Is it
I couldn't hear you. Can you say that one more time?
Theory af neg.
Thank you.
No problem. Just
Is everything you're reading on the doc or some stuff off?
well, I'm gonna give analytics.
Okay, cool.
Everything on theory is in analytics.
Gotcha. Here, I'll let you know when I get the doc.
It'll also start with a little bit of a diss out at the bottom of theory.
Sorry, with what?
A little bit of a diss out at
Okay.
the bottom of theory.
Do you just mean you're reading like it's not a separate off disad, right?
No, it'll just be like probably pretty small, and you can float on their theory thing, and just at like the bottom where you have frame.
It's just a theory argument. You're just
Like
pointing
a
it out to me.
response to their theory argument in essence.
So you're just answering their theory argument and then case
and then
pro
add
con.
neg.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry about that. Did anyone get the doc?
Yeah.
At the top of their theory argument, a pretty important dissent. We think that this is just an excuse to get out of actual discussions about solving for gender issues in the debate space. When they're telling you we aren't topical, they're just getting out of actual substantive debate about structural violence and trying to skew the conversation away for that. That's an independent reason to drop them because they're avoiding the actual debate from all of their education and activism skills we talked about in the top. But on their argument specifically, you defer to reasonability. We're literally just going to read defense and say we need. All of our arguments are central to internal armed conflicts. They obviously weren't listening to Sophia in first cross because our first argument is about Turkey oppressing Kurds with guns in Syria. That's an internal armed conflict in West Asia. But second, on climate diplomacy, we think lots of conflicts like water scarcity in Syria are escalated by climate change. That is a current conflict. If you want to bet on that argument, that's the only grounds they tell you. At that point, we're also preventing future wars. They give you future analysis too. It's topical, but also it's not just current conflict. We think that the resolution asks us to look at stability in the long term, not just what's happening now. So we're still topical nevertheless. On their arguments specifically though, they'll tell you about neg A because of limits. They responded to all of the arguments you read and had a pretty extensive prep out on it. Obviously they can respond to it, but B is about education. They're getting out of actual education, which is talking about structural violence, reason to vote against it. Go to the app flow. On framing, they tell you theory becomes first, but we think that pre-fiat impacts come first because they're the most predictable. All of their warranting, in essence, tell you that pre-fiat isn't predictable, but we read this every single round on the topic so far. We think that it's very, very predictable, and pre-fiat impacts are predictable. That's why they come first, and their warranting doesn't apply here, and it's transformable outside debate skills. On gender, they talked about how neoliberalism denies or degrades the economic social safety net, but none of this is applied to West Asia. None of this is applicable to West Asia, nor do they read a Lincoln to aid in specific. At that point, we tell you Biden is actually trying to solve for the issues. Even so, the issue Biden is solving through diplomacy are a lot better than degrading the social safety net because he's solving for much more violent forms of oppression than things like not having a job. So you can still vote for us here. On climate, though, really easy. They tell you that climate is locked in, but that's a misunderstanding of what climate change is. It's a linear impact, not a brink impact. It can't be locked in. Even so, we can still reduce it. Then they tell you that Gulf oil, group their second and third response. They're basically just telling you the Gulf price won't do anything. This is a misunderstanding of what the argument we read actually tells you. A, the Catullus and Joule evidence tells you that we already have single agreements with individual countries, but B, the Holtman evidence tells you that a regional agreement sparks global action. So I don't care if Saudi Arabia isn't going to agree. I care that writ large, the region does care, and it spills over into a global impact. At that point, it's the cleanest place to sign your ballot. It's the largest impact on scope that actually outweighs on framing. They didn't contest framing. Don't let them go for like nuclear war or something. Go to pandemics. At the top, their uniqueness and link evidence tell you two completely different stories. Their Scientific American evidence from 2020 tells you we were wholly unprepared to solve for any pandemic upcoming, but their evidence from 2020 tells you that GCC is already cooperating on pandemics. That's two completely different things, make them choose. But then you can turn against them. According to the KFF in 2022, the US is the largest funder and implementer of the global health programs worldwide. Through multilateral engagement, the US supports activities that address a range of global health challenges, funding us and providing response to emergencies such as Ebola, Zika, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Here's their second contention about trade-offs. A, there's no link. They misunderstand what the State Department is actually like. It's a compartmentalized thing where people in West Asia are always going to be diplomats there, and diplomats to China are always going to be diplomats there. But B, the US has the resources. According to Garamo in 2020, the US can walk and chew gum because of the unparalleled network of allies and partnership. The US can deal in two theaters and then some. On the impact, their warranting is literally abysmal. They tell you the communications lines might be cut and then jump to nuclear war. They have zero internal link. It is a horrible argument, and they think, or I think they're just trying to get out of actual discussions of structural violence. But let me sit down. Sorry. You have a first question.
Okay. Let's talk about this argument about gender equality. Like your
Which
first
one?
contention. Your first
Yeah.
contention. So the link, the piece of link evidence that says that like U.S. diplomacy should increase to Turkey is literally just talking about like Turkish elections and beneficial relations with the U.S. Nowhere in there does it mention an internal armed conflict. How is it topical?
So again, we didn't read evidence that Turkey is currently oppressing Kurds because that's just a fact.
Wait,
If
you
you
can't
read-
just read a case about like common sense, right? Like I can't just get up here and be like, diplomacy is really good for like space, and then be like, hey, it's common sense because like in Turkey, they're like doing space stuff. No, you have to like read a piece of evidence about an internal armed conflict happening in the region, how US diplomacy would increase to solve the internal armed conflict in the region. You can't just make like broad diplomatic claims.
So yeah, you cut me off like a sentence into my explanation. I would have gotten a lot more into it, so I'd appreciate if we can actually respond to each other's questions.
Go
Does that sound good? So
Absolutely.
our argument, A, we're not even going for Turkey, so it doesn't really matter. But B, Turkey is involved in armed conflicts in the region. If you had contested that only flow of Turkey and not just read something about how writ large you don't think we meet the like actual topic, then I would have engaged in a lot better of a way.
Right, can I respond to that?
We've been on this for a minute 15. I'd appreciate a question.
Okay.
So
You can
on
go.
your argument, are y'all gonna go for C2?
Like, I don't know, or collapse.
Or like how, like,
I don't know.
or I guess better question. On pandemics, how do they disproportionately affect women?
Yeah, so the evidence finds that, for example, when things like pandemics happen, the economic effects of pandemics, such as job losses, disproportionately impact women. But B, when there's things like lockdowns, etc., it inherently increases things like domestic violence rates against women disproportionately. Can I get a question?
Yeah.
So, like, how does kicking out of Turkey solve for the fact that like you weren't topical and skewed our pre-round strat and like made the debate unfair?
Because I responded to those arguments independently, but also that's
Wait, but
literally
like, kicking
just
out of the
collapsing.
contention doesn't solve for the theory argument.
It doesn't solve for the, yes, wait, A, it does, because we're still engaging on the substance of the topic in another sphere. Just like I told you, you weren't meeting our framing.
Right,
That's-
so,
you dropped framing.
I mean, I didn't drop your framing, I spent like
Or
a
drop,
pretty long
like,
time on
drop
it.
China. Right,
We dropped China?
well, like, yeah, never mind.
Okay, so one, your extrapolation as to why your C2 is topical is because you solve current conflicts and because climate change exacerbates internal armed conflicts. One, not one conflict is specified. Two, just because it exacerbates conflict doesn't mean that like by increasing climate cooperation, we're solving internal armed conflicts. C, how is future, like the resolution, like two peacefully resolved conflicts in West Asia? How is it like future conflicts?
I don't think the people in the wording committee were like, let's just look at this aspect of time and hope that debaters only talk about that. I think we should probably focus on writ large the longevity and prosperity.
No,
of
I
the
think they'd agree that like
We're
we shouldn't be like a
10 seconds
conflict
over.
will happen in 8 years. Okay. So, did you start?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll start.
We can't have this discussion. One second. One second. Yeah. Yes.
That was 1.6.
It's gonna be the shell. Yeah, the shell. The shell.
The shell of what?
The T,
Thank you.
Then it'll be framing their case, my case, their case.
My phone was accidentally picking you up when
What?
it said the cell, the cell, the cell, the cell.
Okay. All right. Is anyone not ready? Cool. Let's start on the IVI. They say that we're just like doing this as an excuse to get out of discussions. 3 responses here. First, we have women impacts 2, and literally like in 2, we read women impacts on every topic as well. But 3, even if the app has substantive education and policy, if the NEG can't predict or prepare for it, it's a reason that they shouldn't have happened. Precludes clash necessary to test or framing. It isn't educational. It's not fair. Extend our T-shell. The only other response is like they made a couple problem. First on the after limits to diplomatic efforts with the sole purpose of ending armed conflict in West Asia involving non-state actors whose a violation neither gender equality policy nor climate diplomacy is for the purpose of resolving a current armed conflict between non-state actors, but as a broader diplomatic strategy. The app isn't remotely topical. Hold the line before Emory, because otherwise any article that has the word diplomacy passing can justify new contention and explode the next research burden. 2 reasons why they say they say this topical. 2 reasons why it isn't. First, on gender equality, their own Sackler and Ringer evidence are both about women's rights and issues, not ending an internal armed conflict. The conflict with Turkey is between Turkey and the PKK, but Ringer's talking about crackdowns on Turkey's citizenry. They're complaining diplomacy in general with diplomacy to resolve internal armed conflicts. With B's on climate, their Rahman evidence says climate change is a conflict multiplier for future conflicts, but not that climate diplomacy can resolve meaning end a current conflict right now. None of this is topical. The bright line is the app has to point to current fighting between a state and non-state group that provides plenty of flexibility by allowing apps on Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Turkey, a litany of intersections occurred, etc. They don't do any of this. You vote NEG for 2 reasons. First is limits anything else exposes topic to tangential diplomatic issues between any combination of countries in West Asia, such as arms control, sanctions, security lines, spacing, counterterrorism, etc., which is impossible to prepare in a month, ensuring the app can win every debate by breaking new diplomacy exceptions. They say we prepped them out. 1, no, we didn't. And 2, doesn't mean every other team can prep them out. That doesn't solve any offense here. But B is education. It skirts the core controversy of U.S. diplomatic effectiveness and peace talks, which provides a narrow locus of clash that keeps engagement because the literature is already asked biases. There are few diplomacy bad advocates. They say talking about gendered violence is more educational, but we can't have good discussions if they aren't topical. Let's go on to the framing. Remember, T comes before substance, including their impact framing. Even if the app has substantive education policy, if the NEC can't predict or prepare for it, it's a reason the debate shouldn't happen and precludes clashes to test framing means T is a priority to any case outweighs argument. They just say pre-fiat first because like they're more predictable. How is it more predictable? None of your arguments are literally topical. Then they completely drop the fact that we access their framing. Their own Jackson evidence from case says that ongoing suffering like disease, like pandemics, which we talk about in our case, are discounted by traditional impact calculus. Not that any utilitarianism is a problem. We link in here so clearly on pandemics. Extend the role of the ballot. The role of ballot is to vote for the team who did the better debating. Anything else is arbitrary and insulates the app from having to defend the consequences of advocacy, destroying class that goes completely conceded. They say they're not going for Turkey. Don't let them go for it. On climate diplomacy, a couple problems. We say that Gulf oil producers won't give up fossil fuels. They just say they already have agreements with countries. Gulf oil producers aren't the same as countries. We say that companies are never going to give up these fossil fuels, which means that we are always going to see climate change get a lot worse. On our case, extend pandemics, we say that when the US is in the region, these countries can't cooperate. That's really bad because that means that we see the effects of pandemics are really bad and disproportionately harmful. They say there's zero at the regional efforts are solving pandemics. Yes, we already saw them solve food shocks and we're able to cooperate after the US left the region after COVID-19. But then they say like read a trend that US diplomacy solves pandemic release. One, their evidence is not about internal armed conflict. Literally read it.
We'll take some breath.
That is already prep.
It'll be the T or face staircase. You are not ready. On the T, we did read arguments relating to like internal armed conflicts. Remember, the Franceman evidence in our own case says that like whenever NCAR has increased, women's rights have decreased. We do talk about the curves. And secondly, like on our climate change argument, it talks about like water scarcity, and what Brady tells you is that like diplomacy must look like at climate change when it comes to conflict prevention. So it is topical, but more specifically on their T, they talk about how it's how like well, let's first go on to the dissad. Remember that like when they read the T, it's like an excuse to get out of conversations about women. They say that they talk about like women every single topic, but to the point that like they're reading the T to like get out of the conversation and centering the conversation on women. That's really bad because we're not putting the whole conversation on women, which is really good for like external like pre-fiat impacts. But more specifically, they talk about how like the limits and like there are like two reasons to vote for them about like limits in education. Remember that like when NSCA made this resolution, they weren't just thinking about like this short-term impact. They're also talking about like long-term conflicts. They're just not trying to like limit the scope. But secondly, it's good to get caught off guard because we're building more analytical skills, which is good. Like in pre-fiat world, when we're like policymakers, we can talk about all of this. But plus, they did like prep us out, and on education, we think it's better to like talk about women for education. On our framework. Our framework was just like it's a pre-fiat impact that we read like every round. It's about framework about women, which means that like you can respond to it. Plus, like linking in is not like centering all the debate on women, but more specifically, our role of the ballot is like who affects women the most. More specifically on climate change. The only let's extend it. What Ramahan tells you is that West Asia is worst affected by climate change because they have 12 of the 17 most water scarce areas. That's really problematic because that causes more resource wars. What Brady says that diplomats must look at climate change, and Karen Joel says that like Biden has seen West Asia as a key place to incorporate other countries into climate change. That's why the U.S. is leader. That's really problematic because 80% of people are displaced by climate change are women. That's going to link into like our advocacy because when women are displaced, they don't have policy making. The only thing we outweigh on scope because climate change affects women all over, and when we incorporate like global leaders and like affect other countries, we affect the whole scope. The only thing they say is that like Gulf oil corporations aren't the same, but remember that like at large is the region. Yes, it is the same, but even so, we say that like all the other countries are looking to like the West Asia and the U.S. diplomacy. On their case, 15 seconds to extend and like respond isn't going to cut it. Remember what Pan said in his rebuttal. First, the scientific evidence that's post-dating all of their evidence about how solvency is so great in West Asia says that like the global pandemics has been like very bad. So which means that like West Asia isn't solving, and that's why the U.S. is key because what KFF says is that the U.S. could solve pandemics through like multilateral engagement. They also don't implicate it to like internal conflicts. At that point, it's a very easy balance for us because we impact women all over the world while there's
First question.
Let's see. Sure. On climate diplomacy, even if the US already has agreements with countries, how does that solve for oil companies, not countries, keeping like their fossil fuels going?
Sorry.
So we tell you that like Gulf companies, right, are always going to produce fossil fuels and are always going to have their fossil fuels. You respond with the US already has agreements with other countries. How does that solve for the specific corporations and companies that aren't getting rid of their fossil fuels?
Yeah, so I think that's kind of a misunderstanding of the argument we're reading. Sure, the companies can continue doing it, but insofar as you speak spark regional cooperation, which our Holtman evidence tells you goes global because everyone looks to what America is doing to solve climate change. You writ large solve for global issues.
Right, but locally in West Asia, where the Gulf countries are still producing a lot of oil and still increasing climate change a lot, wouldn't we still see a large degree of impacts affecting women?
I'm not saying we solve for all of climate change. I think if globally we have efforts to reduce emissions, we solve better than, like, we solve pretty well.
That's fine. Next question.
So let's talk about the pandemics argument, right?
Yeah.
You're talking about how or let's go on to like how pandemics are keys. Like, why is the US specifically, like, when we disengage, why
Yeah, so
are there like pandemics?
our AMI evidence finds that US disengagement has forced countries to look inward and bury the hatchet with each other. What this means is that when the US is in the region, every single Gulf country relies on the US for security, for cooperation, rather than looking inward and working with other Gulf countries. So when the US leaves the region, these Gulf countries no longer have like the
Yeah.
US to rely on. So they start relying on each other and start burying the hatchet with each other.
So why specifically does it have to be like pandemics with the US? Like, could they not work on it with the US about like intel sharing and all that?
We'd say that when the US is there, there's no GCC cooperation.
Okay, yeah, question.
Let's see. How does like us prepping you out, like, why does that matter on limits?
Well, wasn't your argument that like you can't engage?
What? Well,
Like the topic
Right.
is too broad, so
because like,
So if you did,
We
I guess it
can't,
was just like.
right, like
my mind-
teams-
Yeah. Also, like, one, it's not just like about like us prepping you out, right? Like, if a team hits you, maybe they don't use the wiki, whatever it may be, they're gonna hit an argument that they have fundamentally no answers to because they're prepping for the topic. Like, your argument isn't topical.
isn't climate diplomacy a very stock argument? Like, I've seen.
just
like,
because
Yeah, and I
just because
think-
it's stock doesn't mean
And
it's
I
topical.
think that's a prime example of teams reading non-topical arguments and them proliferating and everyone reading them when
Right,
they're not
which is why it's
topical.
really bad. And also,
I mean,
like-
how is it the word?
what?
If
How
it's
is-
stock, like, doesn't that
Yeah.
just take
If
away
it-
the?
just because an argument is commonly read doesn't mean it like
What means
like,
that
it's
people, like,
topical, right?
prep it, right?
like the only reason why it's being read is because it's really easy to win on it because no one has responses to it because no one expects to hit a non-topic argument. That's the
I
reason
think
why it's
most people-
proliferating so much.
But that's.
Yeah,
We've used, what have we used? 120 something, I think. It was 123,
140.
140. Okay.
We have 140.
We have 120 left.
It'll just be a framing and then the T. Everyone good?
Mhm.
On the framing, it's fully conceded in the last speech that T comes before substance, including their impact framing. Even if the app has substantive education and policy, if the net can predict or prepare, it's a reason the debate shouldn't have happened in the first place, which is a prerequisite to any substance debate, because if the debate isn't fair in the first place, then we shouldn't be debating in the first place. That means that T's priority 20 keys outweighs arguments. They just say that, like, for example, pre-fiat arguments aren't non-predictable and that we could respond to it. Our argument isn't that like pre-fiat isn't predictable, is that their form of education and the arguments that they're reading aren't predictable because they're non-topical, so people can prepare to respond to them. At that point, extend the role of the ballot is to vote for the team who did the better debating, because anything else is arbitrary and insulates the app from having to defend the consequences of the advocacy. They just extend the role of the ballot without responding to the warranting as to why you should prefer voting for the better debater, which means it's conceded they can't win the case. And substance does matter. Go to the T. Extended A is the interp after limit to diplomatic efforts for the sole purpose of ending armed conflicts via the violation, either gender equality or climate, which is what they specifically went for, are about ending armed conflicts with non-state actors, but it's broader diplomatic claims. We're going for limits. Anything else exposed to topic to tangential diplomatic issues between any combination of countries, which increase the proliferation of any app arguments that are just talking about diplomacy as opposed to the region, which makes it incredibly unfair for us because we have to prep for like literally any article that has the word diplomacy. They've also conceded that losing them incentivizes to read topical arguments in the future. First, they say that we're trying to read this argument to get out of gender equality conversation. No, they've just conceded that we do this in every single tournament, but that we can't predict the form of advocacy that they're advocating for because it's non-topical. We just say it's unfair. Then they say that like water scarcity is conflict prevention. First, they don't specify a single armed conflict, but B, resolve is referring to the status quo. Then they say that they're talking about long-term conflict. One, it's unfair. We can just make up like 1,000 potential conflicts. Two, resolve by definition can't be about the future. To resolve means to stop a dispute there. They aren't resolving any conflicts because there's no conflict happening. Then they say it's good to get caught off guard. One, this is new, but two, this concedes that they are non-topical because they quote caught us off guard. Then they say we prep them out, but they concede that other teams won't prep them out because they aren't topical, so they don't prepare for like any sort of potential argument in the future. At that point, the one argument that they go for isn't topical, drop them.
It'll be T F. Is anyone not ready? We meet their T argument. Our first continue about Turkey. Look at the infringement evidence. It's talking about Turkey violently oppressing Kurdish civilians. That's an internal armed conflict. Our first continue topical. Go to our second intention. We think it's super topical. The Brahmin evidence tells you that West Asia is the most adversely affected region by climate change, but the reason that's important to the topic comes from Brady, who tells you that climate change creates conflict in the long term. That means if you couple them together, there are internal armed conflicts as a result of climate change. You need to address it to have any form or semblance of long-term stability in the long term. We think the NSDA probably thought about long-term stability, not just short-term. They don't think we should just take this moment in isolation and talk about it. Talking about the longevity is important to real-world policymaking. They tell you it only talks about a status quo. I guarantee you that's not educational to only talk about the now and not talk about the future. But then they tell you that they can just make up a bunch of arguments. We didn't. We talked about how climate change actually creates it. That's a real thing. At that point, two reasons to vote for us here. One is about how they're using this as an excuse to get out of actual discussion of gender violence. They just tell you they have talked about like women being oppressed other times. That doesn't mean you aren't affecting it adversely in this round. But then we tell you that getting caught off guard is actually educational because it makes you be a better critical thinker. They tell you this is new. It's still a true argument. It should still be reasons we should get response to this. And if anything, it's a weighing argument against their education. You can vote here too. It's coming basically conceded. They aren't interacting with the warranty. Go to the framing. Their one response is that T comes before framing because we've engaged in the topic in educational in a bad way. We think pre-fiat impacts in framing we read literally every single time, or coupled with internally armed conflict related contentions, is definitely related to it. At that point, you can vote exclusively on our pre-fiat impact that comes from Rao and Sandler. It tells you we're only better advocates insofar as we talk about these impacts in educational systems. At that point, climate is going conceded. We tell you that America would prioritize climate diplomacy because we want long-term stability in the region. That brings into all of our arguments because climate change most affects women the worst.
Around, yeah.
Thank you for judging.